We're going to welcome our panel that will ask the question of whether Afghanistan is lost. It's a great panel, lots of experience in country, so please join me in welcoming them to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited and honored to be on stage with three of the greatest kind of experts on this region who know it quite intimately. So we're in for a treat and looking at a tough question, an old question, to see if there's a new take on this. So before we start, we are going to poll the audience on a question. If you could turn your attention to the television screens on either side of the stage, the question that I want all of you to think about is, which of these options would be the most effective solution to Afghanistan's current problems? A, negotiations between the Afghan government and the Ghani administration with the Taliban. B, ensuring free and fair presidential elections in 2019, or C, complete withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. So take a minute and think about this. And to join the polling session, please text Future of War 2018 to 22333. Some of you may have already done this. And then to respond to the question, please choose your answer, yes or no, and text it to 22333. And everyone's answer will be anonymous. We spent years thinking through this, so you only get 30 seconds. Good luck. Okay, are we good? Okay. So clearly we have a tough conversation ahead of us. This isn't a question that, as I mentioned, is new to our community. And I do think that there's no better panel suited than this one. They know the region really well through different times of conflict and transition and political kind of environments. And I think that's really important when looking at the issue of Afghanistan, that we see it from a multi-dimensional perspective, not just kind of from the military perspective, if you will. We have Candice Rondeau with us. She's a professor of practice and a senior fellow at Arizona State University. Yanni Koskinas, who's a senior fellow here with New America in the International Security Program and CEO of the Hoplite Group. And Ambassador Robin Rafel, who's a senior associate at the Project on Prosperity and Development at CSIS. And just for kind of reference and to put this issue in the current context, recently in the New York Times, former National Security Advisor Susan Rice wrote an op-ed which said President Trump needs to acknowledge that the longest war will go on much longer. And some of you may have seen a BBC report that noted that the Taliban fighters are present in over 70% of the country. And there's also a growing sense amongst experts and analysts that the war in Afghanistan is unwinnable. Now, all of these impressions that are out there in our kind of mainstream political culture would suggest that Afghanistan is already lost. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And when I talked to all of the panelists before, and they all have very different views on this, but they all started with the same kind of sentiment that this is a country of so many million people, and we have to think about it in much more in-depth. And so I appreciate that. And I'd like to start with Candice, who'd spent several years living in Kabul as the Washington Post bureau chief. And she has a really good kind of on-the-ground take on this question.
Yeah, it's a tough question because, you know, there's always a temptation to go back and kind of rehash you know, the elements of the conflict. And I think, you know, most people in this audience kind of know the elements. We're at a stage now where we hear continually, not just, you know, analysts and experts talking about, you know, the need for political settlement. We just heard today, you know, even General McConville make reference to the fact that political settlement is something that has to be prioritized at some stage. So I think we're at that stage now. I think we've been probably at that stage for a couple of years. We weren't, I think, a few years ago when some of the initial attempts to sort of elevate the conversation with the Taliban, you know, with the opening of the office in Doha and so forth. We weren't there, you know, in 2012 for lots of different reasons. But it is certainly time to talk, and it's definitely time to get ready to talk. And what that means is, you know, for the United States, what it means is really prioritizing, you know, setting up a negotiating team, making sure that they understand sort of the parameters, the objectives, the interests of the United States, and what's achievable in, you know, given circumstance, given capacity, given the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan today, and also on the other side of the border, of course, in Pakistan. You know, and then we come to Pakistan, where I think, you know, it's clear that Pakistan needs to get ready to talk too. And, you know, for Pakistan, that may mean relinquishing to some degree some of its commitments to using the Taliban to solve its tariff and trade problems, to solve its water management problems, to solve its border problems. To the degree possible, they really have to start looking at diplomatic engagement as the first track toward solving those problems, as opposed to funding the insurgency across the border. And then for the Taliban, I mean, I think there's a really serious question for them. Years ago, when I was working for the International Crisis Group, you know, I was asked to do a report on, you know, the state of negotiations or the prospect of a political settlement. And the one thing I came away with then that I still think applies today, you know, 5 years later, 6 years later, is that the Taliban do not yet have the capacity to act as honest negotiators at the table. We've seen, you know, the efforts in Doha. We've seen various sort of moments in Paris where we've had, or in Beijing, in China, Japan as well, where we've had Taliban representatives come forward to negotiate or at least begin discussions on de-escalating the conflict. But they're not open, they're not honest, and they're not real about their own commitments. I think it may be that the Taliban currently lack the capacity to engage politically, but they need to be encouraged now that this is actually a political conversation. It's no longer just a military conversation, although, as I was discussing a little bit with Robin last night, you know, there is sort of a mill-to-mill engagement that also needs to happen. So the table, I think everybody agrees that now there's a table, and that, you know, there's a need to sit around the table. The shape of the table is more or less, I think, agreed on, which is to say there are a number of stakeholders, regional as well as internal stakeholders, who need to be at that table. Most importantly, there also needs to be a team of negotiators for all of those stakeholders who are prepared to speak on behalf of their given organizations and interests. At this stage, the Taliban are really the weakest link in that regard. They need to come out of the shadows and sit at the table properly.
Thank you, Candace. Yanni, I'd be interested in your take on the question, but also in reaction to Candace's comments. You spend a good amount of your time in Kabul currently, so I'd be curious to hear your take on if the Taliban is ready to negotiate, should we negotiate with them, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to answer the question, I don't think that Afghanistan is lost, but more importantly, I think Afghanistan is winnable. We have to define what winning is about. I think if you start with a basic construct of maintaining a safe environment in Afghanistan to the point, or some sort of balance that does not allow terror groups to operate out of there, that's about as good as we're going to get in the near term. So that's in somehow a winning you know, stabilization platform that we should be aiming towards. The unfortunate thing is that terrorist groups are operating out of Afghanistan, and we have to maintain the effort there for quite a bit longer than perhaps we're willing to accept right off the bat. And that's part of the challenge that I would throw out to the audience and to the policy groups that may be paying attention to this. We need to stop looking for silver bullets, you know, the fast track to losing weight, the easy way of becoming, you know, gaining back the hair that you lost. All these things are not going to happen, okay? When it comes to Afghanistan, this is going to take a long time. The Taliban, with respect, I don't think are remotely ready to talk the talk we want. They're not prepared to address the topics that we want them to address. They are focused on regime change. They are focused on changing what they consider is a puppet government in Kabul. They are focused on by any means necessary, which means, you know, throwing bodies. They don't care. They're not tired. They're not having recruitment issues, no matter what we want to say, because the fact is the attacks are continuing, the attacks are ongoing. So the violence levels remain at extreme levels. I don't see the facts sort of laying out. Now, I'm not suggesting, because I think Candace is exactly right, we should maintain a dialogue, a mechanism of talking, but I just want the expectation management to stay realistic in the sense that this isn't going to get us there. So when General McConville says, look, we're helping them to lower their casualties so they can actually, you know, reach a negotiated settlement, that's not tomorrow. That's not, you know, a year from now. That's not even 3 years from now. So it's somewhere out there. It's like, you know, used to be a joke with Army soldiers getting in a 15-pax van, and the joke would be, you know, how many Army soldiers do you fit in a 15-pax van? And the answer is one more. You know, it's not 15. So we need to make sure that we don't put these, you know, kind of parameters around, unrealistic parameters, because it gets us in trouble. And if I may, I'll just throw out some facts real quick, and then I want to toss it over to Robin, obviously. 2017, we started this new strategy, okay? The new strategy of supposedly no timelines, condition-based, all this other stuff. But the reality is we have conditions, you know, and we're not meeting those conditions, and the timelines are going to creep up on us. We have 2018 parliamentary elections that were supposed to be held in 2015. We have 2018 midterm elections here that may change the dynamics in Congress. We have 2019 presidential elections in Afghanistan. If they are held on time, that is about the time that we're starting the presidential season for the U.S. here. So things can change. President Trump made a choice, perhaps not even his first choice, of inserting more troops and supporting the mission in Afghanistan. That can change. So I'll leave this portion of the talk, and I hope, obviously, the questions come, by saying we have to meet return on investment at every turn, because the timing is crucial and the clock is ticking.
I think what's apparent in Candace's views and then what Yanni said was that there's this intense debate going on, and it has been going on for a while, over whether you can talk and fight at the same time. And we've never truly, within the policy establishment, I don't think we've truly reconciled ourselves to kind of which approach to pursue, and there have been fits and starts. So you summed that up really nicely, and also I appreciate your comment on kind of the political cycle, both in the region and also in the United States. I think many of us feel that the previous kind of attempts to negotiate have been hijacked, if you will, or you know, overtaken by political events which I think is normal in foreign policy, but it's just, I think it needs to be said. So with that, allow me to turn over to Ambassador Rafel, who has some very nuanced and honest views about how we might actually start having these kinds of conversations, but also just in general on the question. We'd like to hear your take.
Okay, thank you very much, Shamila. Well, on the basic question of whether Afghanistan is lost, I would agree with the other panelists. No, it's not lost, unless you think that the definition of lost is a failure to totally defeat the Taliban. That's not going to happen. So So if that's your definition, then I would say Afghanistan is lost. But I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is how you re-energize efforts towards a political process so that Afghanistan can move forward to a political resolution of this conflict. We all say, or almost everyone says, there's no military solution, but we have thus far failed to really act decisively on that perspective, on that point of view that there is no military solution. So what do we need to do to move forward? First of all, we need to be much more dispassionate and honest with ourselves about the situation in Afghanistan. The current structure of the Afghan government and the constitution is not perfectly suited. There are definitely some adjustments that could and need to be made there. The Taliban, as distasteful as it is and its policies are part of Afghan society. They do have some real support in certain parts of the country. So further demonizing them only makes it more difficult to launch a peace process. And we can't really bludgeon the Taliban to the negotiating table. I think we need to be honest with ourselves that there are elements in Afghanistan who benefit from the status quo. There's a war economy, a lot of people are making a lot of money, and we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware that we can't really fast forward the development of Afghanistan with money alone. We've thrown a lot of money at this problem. The result has been a lot of corruption and, as we say, the war economy. So we need to really redefine in our own minds, certainly with the help of the Afghans, what is the center of gravity of the body politic in Afghanistan? That's where we start, and how do we move forward from there towards a political process? We need to be aware that Pakistan has legitimate security interests in Afghanistan. Pakistan is not out to destabilize Afghanistan. Their concern is primarily about what India is doing there, the whole issue of facing India on two fronts. You can say what you want about that, how legitimate it is, but in the Pakistani mind, it's clear. We have to recognize that this conflict is multi-layered. There's the internal aspect to it, the political internal Afghan parties, but there are also the regional aspects, Pakistan, India, Central Asia, Iran, and then there's the international aspect, the coalition, the United States, Europeans, China, and so on. So it's complicated, and there are many levels, and that means that the overall resolution on the political side cannot be Afghan-led. You need some kind of third party to help bring all of these multiple levels together in a political process. And finally, I'd say we need to recognize that time is not on our side. The more time that goes by, the more insurgent groups that get involved. In the beginning, it was the Taliban. Now you've got ISIS. And as our military commanders say, there are 20 other groups there as well. And you've also got other governments involved. You've got Iran, you've got Russia, China. Everybody's looking to their interests now. So it gets more complicated as time goes by. So the sooner, the better. I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Robin. Candace, from your vantage point of being somebody who has reported from Kabul for several years during a time when the conflict was fairly intense, how would you look at this issue of negotiations with respect to what Robin just said about the role that Pakistan has to play, or that has played historically, and their interests?
Yeah, that's a good question. First, I want to second Robin's point on the need for a third-party interlocutor to manage the process of trying to reach a political settlement. I also want to address Gianni's points as well. You know, as per sort of where the political settlement, lies today, and whether the Taliban are ready, yes, it's clear they're not ready. But the point is to get ready, right? And so we can imagine that this, like the process in Ireland, like the process in Colombia, is going to take many, many years now that there seems to be a general consensus that political settlement is something that we must reach at some stage or another. We should expect that, like Colombia, like Ireland, we're going to spend another 5, 10 years trying to reach that settlement, and that it will have multiple parts, and it will not look like Dayton at all. So having said that, on the Pakistan question, you know, it is also true that India and the rivalry with India is absolutely critical to understanding the tensions. But it's also important to understand the historical tensions between Pakistan and Afghanistan over the borders. You know, we tend to kind of, you know, get involved in the sort of thinking, you know, deep thoughts about India and Russia and all these other larger players. But the border issue between Afghanistan and Pakistan is quite serious, and it has been since 1973, actually since 1948. You know, that historical dividing of what would be called Pashtunistan, you know, has led to a lot of strife in both sides of the border. And so, you know, there's, I think, a need to sort of prioritize that in a very pragmatic way in the diplomacy. There are some very tactical steps that any team, you know, whether it's a US team or another, is going to have to grapple with. And I would say the first thing that needs to happen is just attend the borders. That means really grappling with the issue of water management, which is a very serious issue that, you know, that Afghanistan has yet to solve. By that, you might be able to sort of stand up a commission, a joint commission, a quadrilateral commission between the bordering states where there are these challenges, Iran, Tajikistan, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. The water issue is serious, and it is what drives a lot of the conflict. Lastly, on the border issue, I think you're going to have to talk about the transit of people and goods. And we know that the Afghanistan-Pakistan trade and tariff agreement is not yet complete in many ways. There's still a lot of work to be done there. It has to be treated seriously as part of this pragmatic approach to diplomacy. But for the Taliban, really, you know, we gave them an office. It's now time for them to also give us a point of contact. It's really critical that they assign a point of contact for civilian casualty issues, and that person is not Zabiullah Mujahid, okay? It's really important that we have somebody assigned for water management and border issues, and that person is not Zabiullah Mujahid. It's really important that returnees and refugees have a representative, and that person is not Zabiullah Mujahid. It's lastly most important that on constitutional and electoral issues and political participation, for which the Taliban cries out, whether they imagine an emirate or not, their representative cannot be Zabiullah Mujahid. It's time for them to come out of the shadows and begin taking ownership of their political ideology and stop killing people, you know, with this sort of emptiness of their sort of political content.
Thank you. And one final follow-up question for Yanni before we open it up to the audience. Both Robin and Candace focused a lot on process and policy and the kind of the technical aspects of negotiations. But Candace ended her remarks with kind of a nod to something else, which is the sentiment amongst the public and how people feel about the Taliban as representatives of the Afghan people or as members of the government, given all of this kind of brutal history that we've witnessed. And so because Yanni lives in Kabul most of the year, I want him to give us a sense of what is life like in Kabul right now. What are Afghans thinking about when they think about the Taliban potentially coming back into positions of power and negotiating with the government?
First of all, they're terrified. I think the people I talk to, not just in Kabul but elsewhere, are really scared with some of our, quite frankly, irresponsible conversations. The notion that somehow, some way, everybody in DC and unfortunately it reverbs, you know, to the other spots around the planet, is talking about this. You know, every article talks about reconciliation as the answer. Every article, you know, talks about it's time to make a deal with the Taliban. No matter, not with the nuance that Candace has thrown out, but with this sort of, you know, bullet statement, time to make a deal. And they're worried immensely over this because they think that's our get out of here event. You know, that's the helicopters on top of the Saigon, you know, embassy. That's to them an abandonment message. And let's be honest also about this. We have an example of so-called reconciliation, of irresponsible reconciliation. When you bring in Gulbuddin Hekmatyar into Afghanistan, a guy that was responsible for enormous damage, not to say that others have not been responsible for enormous damage that in fact may be part of the government or may in fact, but they've reconciled and joined the government. This guy has come back and is trying to displace a Hizb Islami party that has been part of the Afghan process and assume once again his messianic sort of leadership role, which was in no small part of the problem that drove us to civil war in the 90s. So we appear, whether or not we really are, it is a subject for another debate, but we appear desperate to make this deal. And quite frankly, that's a desperation that comes out to the Afghans. They hedge their bets. People that may be corrupt figure that I'm going to eat as much as I possibly can right now because the time is cut, getting loose. People think, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, however hard I try, I'm not going to, get to a realistic spot because everybody wants to make a deal. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make with this particular thing is again, I'm a theme guy, so return on investment has to be, where we're delivering on some of the promises that we're making and also being realistic. A acceptable sort of situation in Afghanistan for us is not going to happen through Peshawar, Islamabad, Rawalpindi, New Delhi, any of these places. It's going to happen by strengthening the Afghan government and creating a circumstance there that they can fend for themselves. That is the only answer. The rest of it is, as far as I'm concerned, icing.
Okay, I lied because I want to ask Robin I want to give you a chance to follow up. I want to ask you one more thing related to this. What do you do with this kind of sentiment as a diplomat if you were constructing these negotiations? Surely these views would be would be a consideration for negotiators. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely, of course they are, but I think they represent Kabul and not the totality of Afghanistan. Secondly, I would say that the Afghan people, I think, are as angry with their government almost as they are with the Taliban, because this is a mess. They don't feel secure. All, what Yanni says is true, but it's partly a problem of the governance issue as well as the insurgency. A couple of other things. One, Candace is absolutely right about bilateral Pakistan-Afghanistan issues. My understanding is that the two governments are engaged on a lot of these issues now and should be encouraged to move forward and try to resolve some of them, and we should help as we can if asked. And then finally, I would say the Taliban is more ready for negotiations, I believe, than is widely perceived. Not perfectly ready, and they're certainly the weaker of all the parties in terms of their ability to, understand how you construct negotiations and so on and so forth. But I do think they're more ready. I think their statement of the 14th of February was more than just a message to the Afghan people, and that we need to build on that, and we need to build on the Ghani outreach to the Taliban in his speech in Kabul. And what diplomatically the US should be doing is engaging with all these groups and trying to push towards a consensus, push people together rather than say, well, if the Taliban doesn't respond or isn't up to it, that proves they shouldn't participate.
So you've all just witnessed what it feels like to be in every NSC meeting on AFPAC for the past 10 years. So let's open it up. We have just a few minutes for questions and for the panelists. We have mic runners going around. So Peter.
Comment and question. The comment is, I think the United States has sort of made a category error that the panel helps elucidate, which is we have focused way too much on the question of reconciliation, which, as Candace said, might take, might be Northern Ireland standards, might be, it took 50 years with the FARC. This is going to be a long time. we have this date certain for this election, which may be delayed, 2019. If this election does not go well, I think our commitment to Afghanistan, including with the president and other policymakers, is going to be hard to sustain. If the election goes as badly as the previous two, we have a major problem. If we want real national reconciliation in Afghanistan, a free and fair election that is somewhat accepted by the people will go much further than some deal with the Taliban that might be 10 years from now. So that's a comment. The question is, we mentioned we need a third party. Who is the third party in these negotiations? And as part of this deal, I think it's not widely understood that the Afghans themselves do not recognize the 1893 Durand Line that is the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This is enormously paradoxical because they're always complaining about Pakistan, incursions into their country. If they can't recognize this international boundary, how can you possibly have a deal? And is it possible for Afghan policymakers to actually come to the table with that as a potential deal point?
Thank you. Candace?
Very good points, Peter. So there's no probably one entity that can serve as a third party. Obviously, the UN, has some capacity in that regard and should be looked at as sort of a first port of call, at least in terms of managing the process to some degree. I think that's going to be really important. But on the border issue, actually, and this is actually, it points up some of the complexity of trying to both set the table and then make sure everybody gets something to eat along the way. You'll need another interlocutor, and that will be the International Court of Justice. From my point of view, at this stage, the challenge around the dispute over the border is so severe that, in fact, it has to be solved by a third party. There may be some track two things that can be done along the way to an ICJ intervention, but we've seen recently with Pakistan and India an ICJ judgment around water use and border issues, from a dispute that's been going on since 1965, and whether or not Pakistan really, adheres to all of that. Nonetheless, the judgment is there. We've got to have some sort of bright lines, and unfortunately, none of the parties at the table are really capable of setting those bright lines. So we will need probably different avenues of third-party interlocutors to kind of intervene at various points.
We have time for one more question. Yeah, he's coming.
Chris Miller, Air Force Academy. I'm curious whether the introduction of the advise and assist concept is being positively or negatively perceived by the Afghan security forces, the Afghans as a whole, and the Taliban. Your perceptions on that?
Yeah, I can, if it's all right. First of all, it's long overdue. I think it should have happened a while ago. Unfortunately, the announcement came, that we're going to do this last year, and as you know, the first advisor brigade just arrived. So I think we need to give them a little bit of time, but unfortunately, they're running right into the second poppy season is done, and we're about to get started again, with violence levels. So I think they have a tough road ahead. I think the fact that we're giving them new aviation platforms, new with bunny ears, but aviation platforms and the advisors to support them in that, I think it's immensely important, and it should have happened a long time ago. So again, we have to give them some time for that to mature. It takes a while, but I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. But again, and these panels are important, and New America has been incredibly supportive of keeping this in the forefront. So I mean, it's definitely one of the few that still pay attention to this, quite frankly. But the fact of the matter is, we're talking about the Taliban, unicorns in Pakistan, and all the other stuff. And then the reality is that we have an economy that's failing in Afghanistan because partially it's a war economy. We have enormous unemployment problems. We have governance is not have we talked about governance at all in the entire panel? But it's an essential element of what the national unity government was supposed to be about, reform and getting ready for the next sort of elections down the road. And we've not achieved any of those milestones. So I would implore everybody to actually pay attention for the things that we have promised that we're going to do before we start talking about these mythical creatures that are out there called, you know, reconciliation with the Taliban. And with respect, Robin, it isn't just Kabul. The other parts of the country are even more segregated because they're more socially still challenged with the problems of 40 years, whereas Kabul has sort of reached some sort of equalization. So with that, I've sucked all the oxygen out of it.
No, you haven't. You haven't. Robin's looking at me like she wants.
Everything that Peter says about the complexity, the importance of the elections, and all of that is perfectly true. And all I would say is, as difficult as those issues are, they are not beyond the mind of man to move towards resolution if we get serious about this. And U.S. leadership in getting serious is crucial. Everybody's sitting on their hands to a degree, the Afghan government, the Taliban, Pakistan, and so on, because we haven't demonstrated that we're serious. And if we do, I think we'd be surprised how we could begin to move things, and I think it's very important that this start before the election, because I think if you had a process going, it would set the stage for an election that could be more successful than the last one.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for very interesting conversation.
I'm on. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, we have another distinguished group about to take the stage to answer an equally important question of, does the Pentagon have too much power? So please welcome this distinguished group, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, should have a question coming up. And that question is, does the Pentagon have too much power? That should be an easy answer. So we'll ask you to take a minute or two to answer that.
Right in here.
Looks like it's splitting. You can see it right down here to the right for the panel members. Still adjusting. Well, I have the honor, I'm Ben Franklin, I have the honor to moderate this next panel. We have a great group of folks to talk to, a little bit different from what we've heard this morning. So we have Dr. Corey Shockey, who's the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She's also a distinguished research fellow at the Hoover Institute recently, and is the editor with Secretary Jim Mattis of the book, Warriors and Citizens, Americans' Views of Our Military. She served in the NSC, DOD, and state for starters, but she's just getting going. Major Matt Cavanaugh is an Army strategist and a non-resident fellow at the Modern War Institute at the United States Military Academy. He wanted you to know that he's just completed his dissertation. How about that? Is that pretty great or what? He's earned a Youngest Strategist Award from the Army, and is also Army Athlete in 2009, so he's the complete soldier warrior. He has got a book coming out in May, but he tells me it's out here, called Strategy Strikes Back, How Star Wars Explains Modern Military Conflict. To his right is Dr. Janine Davidson, she's president of Metropolitan State University in Denver. She focuses on student success and better serving the university's 20,000 students. She also served as a 32nd Undersecretary of the Navy, which isn't too shabby for a combat C-130 pilot. So we talk about cross disciplines at Arizona State University. Here's cross-service leader. And to her right is Dr. Elliot Cohen, a Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Study, where he's taught since 1990. And his most recent book is The Big Stick, and he served both in DOD and with the Department of State. So our question is, does the Pentagon have too much power? So we'll start on the right. What say you?
I don't know. Let me say a couple. Let me turn it into a discussion of civil-military relations.
And that's where we want to go with this panel, by the way. Thank you.
So this is an academic's privilege to hijack the discussion. So I guess just a few quick observations. The first thing is that civilian suspicion of the military is baked into the nature of our institutions. I always tell people on July 4th, when I hope every one of you reads the Declaration of Independence in its entirety, including the boring pieces at the end, that you'll notice how many of them have to do with what is summarized in one phrase: he, King George III, has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civilian power. So there are all kinds of historical reasons for this, which I'm not going to go into, but I think it's very important to understand that a certain kind of wariness about military power and military authority goes back to our founding. It's deep in our institutions. Of course, it's reinforced when you have the Pentagon the way it is. There are some features of the current nature of civil-military relations which have to do with the personalities, I think, of our recent presidents and our current president. I'll leave you to think about that one. Some of it has to do, I think, just with some fundamental differences between military people and civilians, which can actually be quite productive. I have a book on that, separate subject. But I think the big issues which I want to just float for you is this. There are really two big issues. The first is the United States made a decision which was perfectly sensible and which cannot be reversed, to have an all-volunteer force starting, let's say, in the late 1960s. It's really the early 70s it takes place. Once that happened, and once we decided that at the same time we would remain the global superpower, we were setting ourselves up for a certain problem, where the military really does become a world apart. In a variety of ways, I believe we have made that worse, and in sometimes subtle ways, to include some of the military's own recruitment preferences and practices. So that's one big one. The second big one, which I think is something for us to think about, is we've been waging war now for 17 years. Those wars have been, in most cases, I would say, either marginally successful, unsuccessful, or simply uncertain. And there is a long-term effect from that, and I don't think we've thought enough about that. We obviously think a lot about the stress that's imposed on the sergeants and the captains. There is stress that's been imposed on the general officers, and that is consequential. And I think that contributes, in a way, to a certain kind of civil-military divide. I'll just conclude by saying, do I think this is a crisis? No. I think it is endemic to our system. I think it's just we're going through a period where it's somewhat more inflamed than usual.
Thanks, Justine.
So does the Pentagon have too much power? Do the generals, including admirals, so by the way, have too much power? And I would say they have an immense amount of power. They have first of all, I would say for three reasons. Number one, because they have all the money. The Pentagon has way too much money compared to the other agencies of government, especially the State Department, and even the Pentagon says so. So that's one area of power. Another reason why they have a lot of power is because they have a lot of respect among the American people. And now whether that's going to sustain, we can talk about further. But compared to the Vietnam era, we all know that there's a thank you for your service culture out there that is almost a fetish at this point. So that gives them an immense amount of power, in a way. And then third, in this administration at least, but I don't think it's just this administration, we have senior military officers peppered throughout other agencies and in the White House, and now we have retired 4-star in charge of the Pentagon in a civilian slot, which I absolutely love, General Mattis, but he is a general. And you know, when people out in the society feel comforted by the fact that we're putting admirals and generals, and especially, you know, retired 4-stars in these sorts of positions, or as the National Security Advisor, precisely because they're worried about the president. People like us who think about this a lot should be a little worried. That's, you know, I mean, General Mattis may be the exception that proves the rule, but let's be clear that we're making an exception here. So those are sort of 3 areas where I do think that the military has a lot of respect, a lot of authority, they're in positions of authority, they have a lot of resources, so thus they have a lot of power. The bigger question is, so what? Are they using that power? And this is where I find, you know, in ways that would worry us. And this is where the sort of the ethos of the professional military officer is really something that we should be comforted by. You know, now that I don't live in Washington anymore and people ask me these kinds of questions a lot, I have to say to them, you have to understand how deeply embedded into the ethos of the professional military officer the idea of civilian control is, and I think still remains. That's something that is nurtured in our educational system, and I think it's something that we have to continue to discuss where the lines are. So, yeah, they have a lot of authority on the one hand, but they're still immensely professional in that sort of Huntington sense of civilians are still in charge.
Okay, Matt?
So the last thing that I had something to say at last event was at Easter at my house, surrounded by small children. So I'm well poised to spot the kid at the grown-ups table, and that's me today. So sitting next to these giants, I really appreciate the opportunity. And I hope that you apply the same standard to me that I do to my kids, which is to say that as long as I don't spit up on myself or make a mess of things, that Easter will be very kind to me. The original prompt for the panel was, do the generals have too much power? And you might not be surprised that I would say no, that I'm sort of biased, but it's a little bit like asking a servant on Downton Abbey whether Lord Grantham upstairs has given too much power to the servants. And I think that servant response would be, the servants have as much power as Lord Grantham thinks that we need. And I think that discussions on civil-military relations actually benefit from a downstairs perspective, a bottom-up perspective, because so much of civil-military relations is presidents and prime ministers and generals and admirals. And so I wanted to raise that downstairs perspective, which is growing partisanship within the military. So I think that we're at danger of losing our norm of nonpartisanship. And I come at this not as a deep researching academic, as someone with lived experience. So a year and a half ago, I was serving in a headquarters in Korea during the primary season. And we would literally huddle in a bunker and watch on a screen during the debates. And you could watch the partisan invective emanate from the screen and divide the soldiers that were there. I stood next to a Mexican-American soldier, and I could almost physically, literally watch his skin crawl. When I returned from that assignment to a place in Colorado, a base that I won't name, but I was greeted at my new desk, not by a smiley, friendly colleague, but by a continuous, steady supply of robocalls from one of the political parties, because at my government phone at a government desk, one of the previous occupants had been aligned with a political party. That shouldn't be the case. So I started digging into the numbers. And in one generation, we've seen a marked shift in partisanship within the military. So in 1976, when surveyed, 55% of officers said that they were either independent or nonpartisan or not affiliated with a party. In 2009, the same question was asked, and the number was down to 16%. And I'm sure there's more recent figures in your book, Warriors and Civilians. Behavior-wise, when surveyed in 2010, 27% of officers said that another officer had tried to influence their vote in the 2008 election cycle. And then Colonel Heidi Urban's study in December of 2015 of 500 West Point cadets and National Defense University colonels found that over a third had observed or shared insulting, rude, or disdainful comments about elected leaders. And then I'll get past the numbers, but one last data point I think matters, and that's retired officers endorsing elected presidential candidates. So there's sort of a moment of inception in the early 90s where we had one admiral endorse one candidate, then candidate Bill Clinton. And we now expect that every election cycle there'll be hundreds of retired officers endorsing presidential candidates. So there has been a marked shift in a generation. And I was just at a conference at West Point where we were talking about these issues, and some very smart people said there's no crisis. That absent a physical threat by the uniformed military against the civilian leadership, we don't have a problem. But I think that's the wrong standard. Just as peace isn't the absence of war, healthy civil-military relations is not the absence of an imminent threat on the nation. So to me, the problem really is that we don't agree on a problem, that we have a problem, and it's almost as if we think that things could get bad, but we don't know how bad they could get. It's as if we've all jumped off a building and we're arguing about where the cement floor is. But we know that there is a cement floor and we know it's bad. And I would remind everyone, today's April 9th. 153 years ago today, General Robert E. Lee, West Point class of 1829, surrendered to Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, West Point class of 1843. The Civil War was only so devastatingly possible because 27% of West Point graduates in the decades leading up to the war chose politics, voted with their feet for secession, and then took up arms against the US government. So that sounds alarmist. It's not meant to be, but it's how serious I think the stakes are with partisanship within the military.
Thank you. Corey.
So there are a couple of different issues that people have been kicking around. One is politicization of our military, and the other is policy influence of our military. And I want to treat them separately. The most important thing anybody has ever said about civil-military relations was Elliot Cohen during the 2000 election, when he argued that it was really important for George W. Bush to win the election so that the military could learn to hate Republicans again. Right? Because you saw so much in survey data about military attitudes towards President Clinton and the Clinton administration. And what they were capturing was the military's abiding earnestness that we should be better than this, that values matter, and American society is so much more tumultuous than that. And you also saw during the Bush administration exactly what Elliot said would happen happened, which is military officers' views became much more critical of the Bush administration. And then when you had the Obama administration, it shifted back again, right? So the important news is that the military should always be skeptical about the extent to which our elected political leaders are trying to use them as socially valuable and politically valuable backdrops for their policies. The second thing I would say is that there's a reason that the public likes the military and doesn't like anybody else. And it is that abiding earnestness, the problem solving, the please don't drag us into the big tumult, we're just trying to do what the country needs from us. That's endearing, and if other institutions of American government would like to have that kind of relationship with the American public, that opportunity is available to them. They are simply not taking it. And it's not just elected politicians. If you think about the way most foreign service officers engage on American foreign policy, the reason people treat them like a weird cultist priesthood is that they very often act like a weird cultist priesthood. Instead of trying to explain to my mom why Afghanistan matters and why Pakistan isn't more helpful to us in that regard. The survey data for the book that Jim and I did on civil military issues comes through very strongly that the public very much wants politicians to do exactly what they are doing, which is objectifying the military and wanting somebody in a uniform right next to them to validate the choices that they're making. As Janine pointed out, literally the only restraint on our military being much more politically active is the professionalism of the military itself. It is their own professional education and ethos that holds that line. Where it has eroded dramatically, as Matt said, is among veterans. I disagree with Janine that Secretary Mattis is a general. Once you are not on active duty, you are a veteran. And just as we shouldn't exceptionally celebrate them and think they're uniquely qualified for these jobs, it also shouldn't preclude them from making contributions to the Republic even after they've retired. I am uncomfortable with the politicization, with endorsements, but that ship has sailed. Moreover, the American public very much likes veterans doing what both John Allen and Mike Flynn did, which is wrap their political candidates in the flag and validate their foreign and national security policy judgments. What we see happening, Peter Fever's research and Jim Goldby's research and Lindsay Cohen's research shows very clearly that public attitudes on the military are changing. They're becoming a lot more like public attitudes about the Supreme Court. Namely, I like it when they agree with the policies I support, and then I have doubts about these guys when they don't support my policies. The last thing I would say is that anybody know which country in the Middle East the United States has the highest approval ratings in? It's Iran, the country with which we have the least engagement. And that too is actually a secret to how popular the American military is, because 50 years into an all-volunteer force, most Americans don't know anybody in the military, and they may mistakenly believe that Matt Kavanaugh or J.P. McGee are normal representatives of the institution as opposed to superheroes. And so there's a tendency on the part of the public to treat the military like they're all uniquely virtuous, perfect posture, great citizens, instead of understanding that they are no better and no worse than the rest of the American public, because they are us. And good civil military, the solution to almost every problem in civil military relations is treating our military like what they are, which is us.
There was no problem in those opening statements, no controversy there. No. So to go a little further, not as late as the Civil War, but during and after Vietnam, there was a factor of lack of trust in the military. In part that when America's men and women, our treasure, were drafted to fight in that war, they weren't employed properly, the truth wasn't told. H.R. McMaster writes his book, Dereliction of Duty. We're transitioning to an all-volunteer force. And so there's a very much of a lack of trust in that institution. It has been rebuilt. Are we in a position of that trust being lost with, you get a $716 billion budget without a whole lot of scrutiny and without a whole lot of justification, where the other departments of government are fighting for every dollar? We see surveys where parents say they don't want their children to serve in the military. And as these military leaders either enter in the fray as retirees or take key positions in the government, if they don't do well, is trust going to erode? Because this is a huge factor, I would believe, in this balance. Clausewitz writes about the balance between the people, the government, and the military. Is trust a problem, or going to be a problem?
Well, I guess if I could pitch in on that, I think it's important not to conflate too many different things. You know, I'm not happy if parents really are opposed to their kids going into military service. On the other hand, would I like to see the Pentagon treated skeptically? Absolutely. I mean, I keep on thinking of that phrase, I've loved wisely and therefore not too well. You know, skepticism is an important thing. It's also important to remember, you know, this is not just sort of the outside looking in, it's also how the military behaved. One of the reasons why, the military came into rather bad odor during the Vietnam War. It had to do with the 5 o'clock follies in Vietnam, briefings of things that were clearly untrue, promises of the end of light at the end of the tunnel, which didn't really look like that, and so on and so forth. As I said, a healthy norm would be a certain amount of friction, certainly a healthy amount of skepticism that's built into the system that we can live with. And I'll just say, there's so much to say on this, I'll just say one thing. I think, and I thought these were wonderful, really wonderful statements, all of which I agree with, except for a couple of quibbles with Corey, but that's an old story. There's a lot that we could do to reestablish some of the connections between the military and the society. And that includes really making sure that there's a bit more of a military presence around the country. So one thing, I'll just pick on the Army. I've always thought it's a terrible idea that the Army is concentrated into these mega bases like Fort Hood or, God help you, Fort Polk. So those of you who've been to Fort Polk know what I'm talking about. Fort Benning, which in one way is very convenient, but it means take my own part of the country, New England. When I was growing up, Fort Devens was an active military installation. When I went through ROTC, that's where we did our drills. It was there, it was part of the community, there'd be people going back and forth. It's why it is economically completely inefficient to have ROTC programs at all kinds of educational institutions around the country. I understand why the military likes to double down on places like Texas A&M, which can generate oodles and oodles of perfectly qualified officers, but it means that you're making sure that there's a whole generation of college graduates that don't really know anybody who's in military service. So I think if we're interested in solutions, we should be looking at, I think Matt Kavanaugh's point about it going bottom up is really important for diagnosing the problem. It's also important for thinking about remedies, and that is the sort of bottom up solution I'd be very much in favor of.
I don't necessarily think that, well, I think that the main issue is that the vast majority of Americans are sort of checked out. They're not just checked out on the military because they don't serve in the military or know someone who serves in the military or know someone who knows someone who serves in the military. That's one part of the problem. But they're also sort of checked out on foreign affairs as well. And so whereas in the Vietnam War, I would assume we know people were watching this on TV every night because they knew somebody that was over there. And so they were deeply interested in it. And number one. Number two, the media were covering it. Today, the media covers the palace intrigue of the White House, right? So the Americans that I talk to are it's a very foreign thing to them, the culture of the military and even international affairs. And so they would have to be paying more attention to have more scrutiny. And all of us have probably this person in their family, but my brother, who's really smart but doesn't study this for a living, he's sort of like my Napoleon's corporal, because he'll come to me and he'll say things like, "What the hell's going on in Iraq?" Sort of like, I've been trying to keep up, but it just seems like we're kind of screwing it up. And he's a smart person. He reads The Economist. He keeps up, and but it doesn't affect his daily life. And so to the vast majority of Americans, whether they trust the military or not trust the military to execute its mission abroad is one thing. Whether they're going to let their son or daughter join the military is another thing. And those things are somewhat separate, but they are alike in that there's just this sort of lack of awareness. So I think ironically it leads to just sort of like, I guess it's okay. They're doing all right? They seem like they have good posture, and they're doing all right.
My wife wouldn't say that.
Right.
My wife wouldn't say that.
So I don't see that sort of lack of trust yet.
So I would actually echo Dr. Cohen's point, mostly in part because I'm from St. Paul, Minnesota, and it was strange for me leaving high school to go to a school like West Point. I felt awkward, or people were excited, but nobody really knew what it meant, and I sure didn't know what it meant, other than 4 years of unpleasantness. And that's my start point, sort of, actually, when we're talking about maintaining a trust relationship with the American public. A trusting relationship is give and take, is equivalent on some level. It's not fawning. And I actually, I think it was almost a year ago, maybe some of you are familiar with a professor at the Naval Academy named Bruce Fleming. And he's an English professor that attended the Naval Academy's graduation and wrote an op-ed in the Baltimore Sun that was incredibly critical of what he believed was over-adulation and overpraise of the sacrifices of the midshipmen to graduate that day. Setting aside the fact that it's a graduation day and hyperbole is kind of the norm, you tell graduates how perfect they are that day. When I read it, I actually got upset. I could feel like heat coming under my skin, like probably a little bit like right now. And my gut reaction was born of the fact that I had just come back from the tour in Korea that I mentioned, which was unaccompanied. And it was a very difficult year. I don't need to dwell on that, but one example is that I tried FaceTime with my 4-year-old, and she got so upset after we hung it up that we never did it again. She couldn't differentiate the screen from why Dad's not home. So I took this general statement of the military not being special personally, and I shouldn't have. And when I came down off of my high horse, I recognized, and I wrote as much later and realized that I would absolutely agree that we're not special, particularly because my mom's a special education teacher in a high poverty part of St. Paul, she's retired now. And Dad signed up for the TSA as soon as he could after September 11th. So I'm well aware that there's a lot of folks out there, in this room even, mostly probably, that serve something larger than themselves, and that service to something higher than oneself is not special to the military. But I would say that it's also fair to say that what we do is unique. I had just learned, Admiral James Stavridis mentioned at a thing offhand that he had spent 11 years at sea, which made me feel like my 1 year of heartache with my family made that a little bit less painful. But, and then of course, Senator McCain, his 5.5 years, I think, in Hanoi.
Yes.
And so I wish that as the relationship goes, that we were treated less special and more just distinct or one way, one flavor of service. Although the free bag thing at airports is cool.
So
That's nice.
The public has an enormous amount of trust in the military. Moreover, the surveys that we did for Warriors and Citizens show that the public, while knowing nothing about the American military, nonetheless gets a lot of the big issues in civil-military relations right. So, for example, they hold the elected political leadership responsible for whether we are winning or losing the war. And that's appropriate, because our elected political leaders are the people who aggregate our societal preferences and determine how much blood and treasure and political effort to put into the war. Where the trust issue, I do think, is dangerous, maybe not more so than in other times, but still worrying, is that what we saw in survey responses from political elites is a growing distrust of military advice, a belief that the military is political and gaming them, and this is where veterans being so politically vocal as John Allen and Mike Flynn were affects the active duty military, because it creates the perception that these guys are all political actors and just waiting to be unveiled, and that they are not giving sound, sensible military advice. And that's absolutely not what our active duty military leadership looks like to itself. So there is a fair amount of friction at that level. But the civil military, the norms of an unequal playing field that Eliot so beautifully has drawn out in his work also hold, right? That the elected leadership's got a right to be stupid and wrong because they're the elected leadership. And it doesn't matter. The military is unquestionably subordinate, and the military views itself as unquestionably subordinate, but the political leadership ceases to think of them in that way. And that's, I think, where the friction is coming now.
Thanks. We're going to go to questions in just a minute. I'm going to ask one more. What's the role of the active duty admirals and generals, vice the retirees, regarding strategy, budget, media, and the political process? How do you see what should be separate and what's mingled? Because sometimes when that military leader comes on the news at night and uses their title, Americans may not differentiate between that. So what's the role between the active duty serving Guard, Reserve, teammates in uniform, and the retirees? Corey, I know you've got thoughts on this. Let's go this way this time. What do you think?
So the public uses retirees as a proxy for the active duty. And veterans who take a political role bear culpability for changing public attitudes about the military, and very often in politicized and negative ways. What Lieutenant General McMaster, as an active duty national security advisor, defending the president's comportment in the meetings with the Russians, for example, that may be very useful to the president. It's actually quite bad for the Army as an institution. And so it's true with active duty military folks in very politicized jobs. My own view is that active duty people in those kinds of roles are both too political and not political enough. They are so political that they cause people to think about the military differently and in a more politicized way. And they are, in almost every instance I can think of, not political enough to be really good, effective politicians. And so it's typically not helpful. Retirees, you know, they are changing people's attitudes. They are making policy people think differently about the military. And it's making policy people hesitant to bring military active duty leaders into their confidence, to tell them what they really think, to have that kind of open and free-flowing exchange that good high-level policy requires. So yeah, I do think it's problematic.
Great. Matt, you've written about this. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of sidestep the active duty generals and admirals part. But the retired community, I think that it can be a very powerful tool. Dr. Shockey just mentioned, for example, that the American public, there's a gap in knowledge and understanding about modern war. It's in part why the book on Star Wars and strategy, to be honest. But I think that it can be a very powerful tool in helping the American public better understand and get better informed on very important decisions that frankly involve a lot of people's lives. I've gotten to know Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. I served with his son in Iraq. I got to know him through that, and he's with MWI as well. And he's an analyst, a military analyst for CNN. And he takes that role very seriously and is very careful, tries to be as careful as humanly possible about the remarks that he makes, and ensuring that he's speaking on matters of policy and not getting into terrain that makes life problematic or difficult for people in the active force. That being said, there is the presidential endorsement problem, and I think it is a problem, continues to grow and fester, and there is skepticism that that genie could ever be put back in the bottle. I am hopeful that it could, because when you consider that there are roughly 7,000 retired generals and admirals out there walking around the United States, the fact that 500 endorsed in the 2012 election cycle and about 200 in the 2016 election cycle tells me that that's the tip of the iceberg, and I'm hopeful that the rest of the folks that are under the surface of the water that want to uphold the principles of the profession would be more vocal about staying neutral. but there's work to be done on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another manifestation of the amount of respect that we have for the retired generals and admirals, the uniformed military, that people do look to these retirees to help them make sense of foreign affairs and national security. So it's another sort of manifestation of a type of power that they do have, and they have to recognize that. I'm not so sure that as a community, they've really got their heads around that responsibility, the way they have their heads around the responsibility of civilian control as active duty members. I just think this conversation is really starting to pick up a lot more because of the trends that you speak of. And so the one thing that really I find troubling is the politicization of these groups of retirees. It's like a competition among the presidential candidates to see how many they can collect. Yeah. And that these senior retired military officers allow that to happen is a little, it's a little troubling to me. I mean, my own father's a retired two-star. He's 80 now almost. And, you know, he gets, everybody wants, you know, they don't really care who he was or what he did in the military. You know, he's a Supply Corps naval officer. He wasn't a huge strategist. They just want his name on the bottom of the sheet. Yeah. And I find that really distasteful. And so that's really troubling.
And yet you endorsed a political candidate and you would deny your father that ability.
No, I mean, I do think there's something fundamentally different about admirals and generals. They have a level of respect from their 30 and 40 years of service that is not the same as even if you get out as a major, it's not the same.
Yeah, no one's gonna listen to me.
Yeah, I'm just some.
No one's listening.
I do think it's a little different. I think one of the wisest things that Corey pointed out, though, was this issue of the politicization of an active duty officer, and the HR as an example that. You know, he's in an awkward position because that position requires someone who's a political animal. And that's an uncomfortable and unfair position to put a three-star in. And you pointed that out, last year, and I think that that's a really important insight.
Okay, I don't have time to be diplomatic. So first thing, I've yet to meet a retired general or flag officer who says, just call me Mr. They go by general or admiral. Secondly, there is a big distinction between what is legal and what is right. Legally, they can endorse people, they can do all that stuff. I once in an op-ed said, it's also perfectly legal for them to go off after retirement and become pole dancers in Las Vegas.
And that's the most important.
Wow, I did not need that visual.
which got me angry emails from a couple of general officers, and then I have to report a bunch of emails from colonels saying, let me nominate a few. I think the truth is most retired general and flag officers understand that they have a special kind of status and actually are quite careful about it. But the fact is, I believe they have responsibilities which go on afterwards. I do want to pick on the active duty thing. So I spent 2 years with that cult, what did you call them? Bunch of cultists taking a swipe at my diplomatic brethren in arms, who are really the Foreign Service, who actually are quite misunderstood and quite selfless, and in some cases extraordinarily courageous.
Yes.
In a way
So
that
I was a senior official in the State Department, and I can tell you, having spent a lot of time in the Deputies Committee, that friends of mine in the Joint Staff had absolutely no problem giving me terrible advice about foreign policy. They were extremely free with it. They would not respond nearly as well if I gave them probably terrible, but maybe not, advice about military affairs. So I confined myself to asking awkward questions, which made them mad instead. I think it's very important to remember that just because you're a general does not mean you have good foreign policy judgment.
Right.
In fact, it often means you have terrible foreign policy judgment. I'm not joking. You know, the greatest strategist, supposedly, in the United States Army was a man, and before World War II, was a man you have never heard of, Stanley Embick. He was, you talk about America First, he was a real America Firster. He was against any kind of aid to Great Britain. His judgment about the world was awful. And I've met plenty of general officers whose foreign policy I believed were not particularly well informed and not particularly helpful. That's not an argument for having, bright lines of separation. It is in the nature of policymaking that there'll be give and take and back and forth. But I think that, you know, what senior level military leadership gives you, it gives you expertise in whatever your field is. You know, do I trust admirals to be experts in counterinsurgency? Not so much. You know, would I want General Freckley to be running some major fleet problem? I don't think so. So there's a specific area of expertise, and there's a kind of general leadership experience and gravity that goes along, I believe, with those experiences. It does not necessarily translate, it can, but it does not necessarily translate into expertise on policy.
There you go. Okay, how about a question? Right there. Please.
Hi, Austin Bird, Army National Guard. So 2 questions. First, I think we've asked the wrong question. It should be, have we given the Pentagon too much responsibility? Have we asked the military to do too many things? And with all that has come the power. The second thing I would say is, at the grand strategy level, is it not essential for our admirals and generals to be a part of policy making and absolutely in politics? Thank you.
Anybody?
Well, okay, so the first one. I mean, who else is going to run military things if not the Pentagon? A. And B, a lot of the missions that we assume, well, boy, that's not military business. Actually, it is military business and historically always has been. I would just point out military governance as one which we fell down on in the biggest possible way in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I mean, I remember getting fingers in the chest from my irate general officer friends when I became temporarily diplomat. You know, why isn't the State Department here running Basra or something? The answer is, you know, when Hurricane Katrina happens, the mayor of New Orleans doesn't say, please send me 3 ambassadors as soon as you can. The military has the resources, it has the manpower, it has the logistical expertise to do all kinds of things. And I don't think they're being asked to do things which are inappropriate, particularly if you know anything about military history. Grand strategy, I have a problem because I don't really believe it exists. But the fact of the matter, anyway, is that in normal governmental processes, the military is absolutely heard. You know, if you have NSC meetings, the secretary's going to be there, chances are the chairman will be there, deputies committee meetings, there'll be the J5, the J3. The problem is not that the military voice doesn't get heard. Trust me. And even dereliction of duty, HR's book, which is a good book, there's a problem with the premise, which is that somehow LBJ didn't know what the generals thought. He knew exactly what the generals thought. He just didn't want to listen to them, that's all.
Right. And that is his prerogative.
Which is his prerogative, or was.
Right, so I mean, we've both written on this, but I mean, I think that it isn't that the military's not at the table, and it isn't that they're not saying stuff. It's that the civilians and the military talk a different language, and they don't understand each other. And that is probably a problem of education. I mean, we don't have any control over where the civilians come from and and how they arrive at this table. We have to do a much better job in helping them have this dialogue that you call the unequal dialogue, because at the end of the day, the civilians get to make the call whether they listen to the military or not. And that presupposes that they understand, right? And so I think that's and I'm with you on grand strategy too.
They also lead different lives, and I think this is a really important thing. As you're a general officer, you will probably never really have anybody yell at you, or it'll be rare. You'll be treated with more and more deference the further you go up. So if you're a politician, or for that matter, a professor, the higher up you go, the more people you have every day in your face saying you're an idiot.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
it really
good
does
point.
breed different ways of interacting with people, I think.
Okay, since we're between you all and lunch, we're going to break for lunch, and the panelists will be around. Let's not any of us be yelled at as idiots, and I want to thank the panel for a great job.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I think it's also going to be really important in the next presidential election, whoever's elected, and I, I'm going to certainly do what I can to get through and that there is an issue, and that they have to set a tone and I think in some ways Mattis has tried to do.
I'll tell you what's abhorrent to me. The Army has these 7 values, one of which is respect. Okay,
right.
So how does Mike Flynn get up there at the Republican National Convention, and a woman who's been the First Lady of the United States, the Secretary of State, a senator from the state of New York, and not say, stop it. If she's violated the law, the Justice Department will determine it, but we're not going to act that way.
I love John. I also wish John I mean, Flynn was crazy. He was really over the top. Nuts.
One of the things, to your point about, ambassadors don't need to rush to Katrina, and Ben Franklin couldn't keep the Straits of Hormuz open with a naval battle fleet, which is true. I'm an infantryman. Part of picking military people to serve is, are they prepared to do what they're asked to do? And in HR, I've known HR for 20 years, and HR is defense. When the president went I wasn't going to get into it. I want it to be y'all's panel, not mine. When the president of the United States asks a serving officer to do something and he says no, the next thing he does is retire. That's your only choice.
So look, I know. I actually told. Hey, Katie. Hey, John. I actually talked to I said, "This is a big deal." I mean, I didn't say don't take it. I mean, I didn't feel right to, but I said that is a policy. You can never go back.
I mean, Powell did, and didn't Scowcroft go back? Did Scowcroft fall on?
Scowcroft did not go back on it.